no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. Welcome back to the Summer of Satan. It is the Summer of Satan. We're talking satanic panic here. My name is Gabriel Hacohen. I'm here with my BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor, Sadie Carpenter. How you doing today, Sadie?
I am doing fantastic. I'm really excited to get into this episode because on the surface, it may not seem like the most satanic panic related episode. It's an episode about debunking another one of Jack Chick's sources, who was a grifter very much along the lines of John Todd, but his story was that he was a former Catholic priest, and now he's going to tell us all how the Catholic Church is a tool of Satan.
Everything's a tool of Satan, unless you are a specific vein of fundamentalist or Baptist or Bible-believing Christian. In America, all other countries are compromised pretty much.
And all other religions and denominations and even sub-denominations of Christianity. This is the first part of a two-part episode. Alberto Rivera made so many wild claims that we are going to take 2 episodes to debunk his claims.
Yeah, like I remember John Todd had like one comic that was based off of his that we read. And we're just like, okay, well now, and that was like our gateway into John Todd. And then we listened to a bunch of his species. We gave a life story and kind of just like, because he kind of said the same thing. But Alberto Rivera has like, we found the Alberto comic book series that Jack Chick and Chick Publications put out. It was illustrated by Fred Carter. And it like featured Tim and Jim, the Beefy Boys for Jesus, as characters in the comic. There's like 6 or 7 comics in this series of comics, and they're all just chock full of claims of this and that and the other thing, mixed with like things the Catholic Church is doing, plus Alberto's supposed life story, plus other things.
Yeah, and he makes so many fantastic, highly specific claims that it gives us a ton to debunk and a ton of just little granular things that we can look up to verify or disprove his story.
And there's a lot of people that have also done that in the past, because this was kind of like a big thing within that vein of Christianity was, do you believe Alberto or do you not? And that was kind of a debate that people were having.
But I have done there are a couple things in here that are my original research that nobody appears to have done on the internet before.
Yeah. And
this episode was so fantastic because this 2-part episode, this is I think the broadest array of things I have had to look up for an episode.
But also most of the information that we needed the claims were so specific that they were easy to investigate, most of them. And also the broadness of what you're talking about gives us, it's like going into an orchard and picking all the apples that you want and they're all looking very juicy, is kind of how I would describe doing the research for this episode. So we had a lot of fun. But before let's
get right into it.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's get into this. But before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast about my BFF and co-host Sadie Carpenter's life in and escape from the independent fundamental Baptist cult, the cult in which she was raised. So we talk about this cult, we talk about other cults, we talk about religion, we talk about fundamentalism, we talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole. And it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you're a fan of our show, that you can do some things to support us. Number one, you can join our Patreon, where you get an extended and uncensored version of most of our episodes. Last week's episode about Bob Larson and his rock book, I think there was close to 40 or 45 minutes of bonus content on the Patreon just for that episode alone. So you'll want to check that out. That was a lot of fun to do. You can join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Eden Exodus. You can join our subreddit, reddit.com/r/Eden Exodus. Both are great places to discuss the show and your own personal experiences with other listeners, talk about fundamentalism, share memes, just like shoot shit about religion. It's a fun place, a good hang. We've got a really positive community. I love our community. You can also check out our merch selection. It is the Summer of Satan, and you can get the Summer of Satan specific Leaving Eden podcast merch, the new design where it's got the little an apple with the devil horns, and I used the death metal font on that. So that was fun to make.
And thank you so much for making that. I asked you for cute but evil, and this is probably my favorite merch that you've ever made.
I'm really excited for the ones that we come out with going forward because I want to do more merch designs. But all of the merch designs that you see on the shop are designed by mostly me with input from Sadie. Is how
I did our Pride shirt this year, though. That was me.
That was Sadie's idea, and it was awesome. And we had some people order it. So and that was cool because all the proceeds from Pride themed merch go to support LGBTQ charities and causes. Speaking of patrons, though, I just need to thank our Faith Promise Missions and I Gave It All to Your patrons. So we have 3 I Gave It All to Your patrons. We have Kathleen Moncrief and Melissa Mosley. And also we have, on behalf of his wonderful deconstructed wife, Madeline Antrim, we have Todd Dale. So thank you to everyone who supports us at the I Gave It All tier level. You guys are amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And our Faith Promise Missions tier patrons, your names are Alex P., Alicia Guild, Ali Allen, Anisha Patel, Ashley Dox Tater, Brooke Tully, Chrissa, Crystal Patterson, Dear Ethan Hansen the Musical, Dora J., Enchanted Fairy, Esther M., Hannah Ross, Hope Norum, Horton Here's a Shane, Janine Collin, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Kat Henwood, Kay Turwee, Kitty Kate, Kristen Marie, Learned Vixen, Lita, Linda Morgan, Lindsay Goss, Lorena Watson, Madeline Cusick, Marlena Stuve, Marcia Millard, Mary Williams, Mary Martin, Megan Arendt, Rob the Methodist, Sarah Reese, Stephanie Johnson, Steve and Amy, Susie, Tara McNamara, the Loch Ness, Tiffany Enderby, and as always, Wes the Cowboy. Those are our Faith Promise Missions tier patrons. Thank you guys so much for contributing to our Patreon, and thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon.
Yeah, big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters and to everyone who supports our podcast in different ways, especially through sharing us on social media, talking about us on the whatever Fundy Snark internet forum you happen to be a part of, putting us in your Instagram stories and mentioning us to friends. All of you help grow this thing that we're building as well. In general, we talk about a lot of potentially triggering topics on this show, including but not limited to suicide and mental health, racism, misogyny, PTSD symptoms, child abuse, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we'll mention at least a few of these topics, but we try to avoid any graphic detail unless it's relevant to the story that we're telling. And we do our best to give the audience a heads up before going into detail on any of those topics. This episode in particular will mention many of those topics. I don't believe that we're going to go into any additional detail. Is there anything that comes to mind that we're planning on talking about?
No, I mean, there's like some for next, because we wrote this episode in like both of the parts together. So it's kind of hard for me to separate what goes in this week's episode and what goes in next week's episode. The only thing that I'm thinking about is that there's like some Holocaust stuff in next week's episode, I think.
Yeah, that will be in part 2.
That'll be in part 2.
That is more graphic. There is just a very brief mention of sexual assault in part 1, but that's literally all it is. So just a very quick mention. So I think we're probably okay on that. I do want to recognize, however, anytime we talk about the Catholic Church, I think it's necessary to give recognition to the crimes against humanity committed by the church, particularly in residential schools. That's not the topic of our discussion today. So if that's a trigger for anybody, we're not going to be going into it in detail on this particular episode. I did say in an earlier episode that this month that the church hasn't poisoned anyone in the last 50 years. Unfortunately, I learned that I may be incorrect on that. Someone informed me that the residential schools were known to force Indigenous children to drink milk, although many of them were lactose intolerant, which made some people very ill. So I appreciate that correction, although it makes me sick to hear of yet more abuses. I wanted to clarify that correction, as well as let people know that this episode is not at all intended to be the church has never done any crimes at all. This episode is the church has not done these particular crimes because this particular person is a liar and we can prove it. This episode is also in no way meant to be a defense of Catholic theology and doctrine and tradition, as like this is correct or this is what you should believe. We are going to clarify Catholic teaching on some points because we're trying to show how it has been misrepresented on purpose in order for Jack Chick and Alberto Rivera to use their misrepresentation of Catholic teachings for their own good. So I wanted to clarify my intentions with that at the start, for both as a trigger warning and as just a statement of intention.
But let's go on to these claims. So Alberto Rivera came to Jack Chick very much in the same way that a guy like John Todd would. He came to Jack Chick and said, I have a story about being a being a priest, being part of the Catholic Church, and these are the things that were going on. And Jack Chick basically used the stories that Alberto Rivera told him to publish comic books that were intended for children and young adults in order to feed them anti-Catholic propaganda. So were you reading these comics when you were a kid?
Yeah, absolutely. I was not only reading these full-size comic books like Alberto, Double Cross, the Four Horsemen. I was also reading Jack Chick's smaller, like the Chick tracts that deal with Catholicism that are also partially based in Alberto's claims.
You thought, okay, this is right.
Sure. We're going to get into Alberto's claim of having been a trained spy to infiltrate fundamentalist churches, but I was looking around our church wondering who the spy was.
That's wild.
I promise I am going to get to what I think that does to people and why I think Jack Chick would want people to think that way.
So let's get into... I want to do...
we need to tell his story first.
Do you want me to do like a general overview of what Alberto claims the Catholic Church is trying to do before that? Or do we want to tell... Okay.
So what are his main claims?
So Alberto's main claims, and Sadie and I both read these comics. They're all available for all of you to read on the Wayback Machine. If you want to go there, we'll include a link to where you can get them. But you can, I think you just have to put your email in and you can read them for free. But Alberto's main claims about what the Catholic Church is doing, that he says that he was a priest, he was a trained spy to infiltrate churches, like Protestant churches and Baptist churches, on behalf of the Catholic Church. And basically he says that the Vatican serves Satan and that their strategy is to be fake Christianity in order to keep people from actually following Jesus. The Vatican has a plot to bring about one world government and one world religion. This plot its success hinges on Vatican having control over the holy city of Jerusalem. Pretty much every single evil plot over the past 1,000 years or more, basically from the Holocaust to the rise of communism to the Crusades, has been a Catholic Inquisition because the Spanish Inquisition never actually ended or whatever. Basically, the Vatican is playing the long game in order to achieve their goal. And finally, and most crucially, the last thing standing between the Vatican and their goals to get world domination is good Bible-believing Christians in the United States. And so that is where they are focusing their targets now. And by now, I mean in like 1980, which is when Alberto was like telling the story to Jack Chick and Jack Chick was putting out these comics.
Yes, Alberto really rose to some level of prominence with these stories around 1980. So Alberto claims that he was a Jesuit priest And because of who and what he claims Jesuits are, that's why he was privy to all of this information about the secret plot to take over the world. So I want to start with a quick explainer of what are Jesuits, who are Jesuits. The Catholic Church has 7 sacraments. The sacraments are seen as channels by which the saving grace of God reaches a human person. They're visible signs of the invisible grace of God. No one sacrament is the exclusive manner by which a person is able to receive God's grace. It's not like, oh, you got to get 3 out of the 7 to go to heaven, or you got to get 5 out of 7. It's not a got to catch 'em all situation. Lots of devoted Catholics end up getting 4 or 5 or 6, receiving 4, 5, or 6 of these sacraments during their lives, but it's actually impossible to get all 7 because 2 of them are exclusive of each other. The 7 sacraments are baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, confession, marriage, extreme unction. Last rites is what extreme unction used to be called, and now it's called prayers for the sick, and holy orders. Holy orders is often misinterpreted to mean anybody who participates in religious life. So a monk, a nun, a local priest, a bishop, an archbishop, a cardinal, a pope. But holy orders actually only refers to men who are ordained to either be a bishop, priest, or deacon. I have probably made that mistake on this podcast before. So joining religious life is not a sacrament. Holy orders is a sacrament. So becoming ordained as a priest, a deacon, or a bishop. And that is only open to men. Y'all can just fill in my facial expressions. So religious life is monks, nuns, religious brothers, religious sisters, the people that you might see doing charity work, doing mission work, doing evangelization. They're the people that you see in movies, nuns with a very particular style of dress and maybe a white headdress on, or monks that perhaps have a brown robe that is tied with a belt. These people have joined one of many, many religious orders within the Catholic Church. A religious order is a group of people who all take vows to live by certain guidelines. Most commonly, they live in the same place, they are financed by the church or by donors, and they are all working on the same type of mission. It's almost kind of like how a fraternity or a sorority might have a particular charity that they support. So you've heard of religious schools that are all staffed by monks, or all staffed by nuns, or all staffed by priests, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's one type of mission that a religious order might do. Another religious order might, we are this particular order and our mission is we run an orphanage in this town. Another religious order might have their mission be charity for the poor or feeding the poor, and that's what we do all day, every day. We wake up, we feed the poor, we say some prayers, we go to sleep. So it is intended to be an avenue for a person to live a life of service to the church to the extent that they do not have a job out in the world. They get to live in full-time service to the church and to whatever the mission of their religious order is. And if you have been listening to this podcast for long, you probably feel the same as I do. Like, wow, a life of service. That sounds awesome. But man, this is ringing every alarm bell that I have. Because you just see like, oh no, that could be potentially so abusive. That could be potentially so cult-like or toxic. But also like, wow, the idea of living your whole life to serve other people sounds great. So some orders might be devoted to prayer. And that's where you're going to see people in religious life that don't leave a convent or don't leave the monastery, and they all pray together multiple times per day at set times, and then they devote time to prayer outside those set times as well. And their whole job is to pray their whole life. So the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, are a historic religious order founded by Ignatius of Loyola in Spain in 1540. The members of the Jesuits are not monks. They are ordained as priests, and they live in this order of religious life. They don't often get assigned by the church to be the priest at a certain church, like the pastor at a certain church. Instead, they get assignments of where to go, where to minister by the Jesuit hierarchy. The main interests of the Jesuits are arts, education, philosophy. They are often seen as the intellectual arm of the Catholic Church. This is due to one of their founding philosophies, which is find God in everything. So find God in art, find God in music, find God in philosophy and in education. And this is why the Jesuits have a reputation for often running institutions of higher education like high schools or colleges, universities.
They also have their fingers in a lot of different pies. And so people see them.
Right.
Yeah.
Which has kind of been an issue for them, as we are going to discuss. The Jesuits have been plagued with conspiracy theories pretty much since their inception. The name that was chosen for the Society of Jesus, was very unpopular in 1540 in Spain. People thought it was blasphemous to include Jesus in the name of the organization. There were many documents, which are now considered to be forgeries, that purported to show Jesuit plans to use their education, use their knowledge to rise to positions of power. Well, get yourself to be the confessor to the king, and then you have power because you know all the king's sins. Get yourself to a high place in society. We will get in depth into some of those conspiracy theories later, but this is both the name and the perceived vying for power were the things about the Jesuits that drew negative attention early on.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that Pope Francis is a Jesuit and that he is the first ever Jesuit Pope.
That's correct. Jesuits take an oath to be loyal only to the Pope. So this is a little bit of a catch-22 issue because it kind of means that Pope Francis is his own boss right now.
So according to Alberto's comic and according to these conspiracy theories, basically the Jesuits, depending on which way you want to look at it, the Jesuits are either the secret faction above that's like pulling the strings of the church, or they're like the KGB that's working for the church to infiltrate everybody. Depending on where in Alberto's story you are, that kind of flips around. Sometimes it's all just its kind of own spiderweb.
So there isn't a top religious order in the Catholic Church. Each order has leaders, and each order has their own hierarchy. And then the people who are in holy orders are most commonly under the authority of the bishop in whatever diocese they operate in. So if you are a nun who lives in a convent in Minneapolis and you run a Catholic school there, you report to the Mother Superior, and the Mother Superior reports to whoever's the bishop of Minneapolis. And then that bishop reports to an archbishop and to a cardinal and to the pope. And that's how the hierarchy works. The Jesuits are the largest religious order in the Catholic Church, but they're not in charge of the other religious orders. That's BS. That's not how it works. This comic says that there are about 102,000 Jesuits. I did some looking, and I think we're starting off strong with a really bad claim. In 1965, the numbers were reported as 36,038 members of the Society of Jesus. And the number has been Jesus. And the number has been reported to be in decline since then. In 2022, the society had 14,439 members. So either Alberto was lying about there being 102,000 Jesuits in the 1980s, or he knows something that we don't know.
So let's get into Alberto Rivera's story, like his own autobiography as he tells it.
So we're starting with Alberto. It is the first comic in the Alberto series, and the story is told in a series of flashbacks. So we're going to really do our best to keep everything in order and understandable as far as his life story.
I just want to point out that the way that this comic is told is Alberto goes to Tim and Jim, the Beefy Boys for Jesus, and is like telling his life story to them. And that's the way that this it's weird for me to be like, oh, this is definitely a true comic when you have like this this supposedly real character in the comic telling his story to two fictional characters in the I'm like, what is going on? Like, I wrote my autobiography and it says that I'm friends with Spider-Man, like not Tobey Maguire or whoever's, or Tom Holland, whoever's playing. So I'm friends with like actually Spider-Man.
Spider-Man.
Peter Parker.
So there's Yeah, that is a very confusing literary device being used by Jack Chick. Like I said, we're going to do our best. Alberto opens in Spain in 1942. 7-year-old Alberto is being led into a Jesuit seminary where he will start his training to be a priest. So 7-year-old Alberto is being led into seminary at a Jesuit cemetery where he is going to start his training to eventually be a priest. I do want to note that's not as inaccurate as it sounds. I've personally known priests who entered seminary at 13 or 14 years old. 7 is a stretch and not something that I think is happening in 2023. But in 1942, this is plausible.
7 is old enough for the age of accountability if you're IFB. You're old enough to declare yourself a sinner and say that you want to be saved by Jesus. So...
and change your destiny of your soul forever. 2 years later, so around 1944, Alberto's grandmother and 2 aunts come to pick him up from seminary to visit his dying mother. As his mother was dying, she was screaming about seeing monsters and ugly things coming for her. But the priest who came to visit her said she's received the sacraments, she's even got a special indulgence from the Pope. I don't know what's up with her.
The thing I noticed here was that his father says nobody was more devoted to the Virgin Mary. Not nobody was more devoted to God or nobody was more devoted to Jesus.
Yeah, and this is more of a normal Catholic thing to say than a lot of other things in this comic. There's a lot in here that is just complete propaganda, made up BS. This isn't necessarily one of them. That's a thing that somebody might say about a Catholic mom. Of course, Chick is telling the story that he's telling. So, of course, he chooses to emphasize this rather than anything else that the characters might have said. But Marian devotion is definitely something that is plausible to see from a Spanish Catholic in 1944. This makes sense. I do have a lies about Catholicism alert from this section of the comic.
Hit me.
Alberto sees his mother die in fear. And why was she feeling afraid? Why was she saying she was being dragged to hell when she had received all the sacraments and she got an indulgence from the Pope? Like, what's going, so Alberto says, Father Abraham must be a liar. He's supposed to be Jesus, and Jesus didn't help. An asterisk leads to a text box at the bottom of the panel, which reads, Canon law and dogma, by reason of ordination, the priest is granted 2 powers, to forgive sins and perform mass. These place him in the position of Jesus, according to Roman Catholic teaching. This in the position of Jesus, that's a misdirect. Talking about the Christians of lots of different types talk about, I want to be the hands and feet of Jesus. Like, this is a metaphor that's really common. The Catholic teaching about priestly authority is like halfway between being the hands and feet of Jesus and the fiction that Chick is spinning here. In persona Christi is, in layman's terms, a priest's ability to have Jesus act through him, only when performing certain religious acts, namely the consecration of the Eucharist and the forgiveness of sins in confession. So it's kind of like channeling Jesus or letting Jesus use you as his puppet. It's a similar concept to somebody who has power of attorney and can sign a legal document for another person and the legality of the document holds up. It's a personal representative of Jesus. It's having power of attorney for Jesus. So I wanted to clear that up because Chick will claim many times in his anti-Catholic literature that priests or the Pope are considered to be Jesus present on earth. He will have popes proclaiming, I am Jesus on earth. And while this Catholic doctrine of in persona Christi goes well beyond the typical do good things and be the hands and feet of Jesus that is common in Protestantism, it is not a belief that the Pope is Jesus on earth. It's the belief that the Pope basically has Jesus's power of attorney. So this is where Tim and Jim come in. So this is where, like, Alberto's real story gets mixed with the fiction of Tim and Jim.
Also, although, like, Alberto's real story is about as real as Tim and Jim, the Beefy Boys for Jesus.
In the part of this comic that is fiction, even though the comic is supposed to be nonfiction, Tim and Jim are contacted by one of their friends in the super secret Beefy Boys for Jesus Real Christian Club. So they are contacted by one of their friends in the club, and they are asked, like, hey, can you take this guy, Alberto Rivera? He is on the run from the big bads who are out to get him. So Tim and Jim they're there as audience surrogates, basically. Like, Alberto needs to be able to talk to someone and tell his story and all of these flashbacks. So it's exactly like in the first Beefy Boys for Jesus comic that we reviewed months ago. Like, one of the two would ask a question and then the other one would have a convenient reason to go off on like 2 or 3 pages of exposition on theology or a Bible story or whatever Chick was trying to get across. I don't think the Pasadena Playhouse School of Theater taught show, don't tell very well in this case.
Either that or Chick never, or Chick just doesn't respect his audience enough to be willing to do that. Do you remember why John Todd was discharged from the Army? This is my question.
Yes.
Because he was unable to distinguish reality from fiction.
Right.
I wonder if, due to the fact that Chick is clearly blending like real people with fictional characters and saying this is true, I wonder if he suffers from the same problem that John Todd did. It would make sense.
It unfortunately would. I think a lot of us have learned, like, when we meet someone with a wild story who is asking us for help, to think through their motives and respond accordingly. Like, does their story make sense? Do I get a vibe about them? What motive would they have to lie? What evidence supports the truth of their story? I think a lot of us learn this because one of 2 things happened to us in the past. We either believed someone when we could have figured out that they were not being honest and we got burned, or because we blew someone off who really needed help and then we learned later that they were legit. So we learned more discernment. We learned to hold space for, I don't know if this person is legit or not. Let me look into it in good faith. And that's what I think Chick never learned. So Tim and Jim meet Alberto as an adult. He needs a place to stay for a few days because his car was run off the freeway and it's being repaired. They ask him who ran his car off the freeway. Like, was it a drunk driver? And Alberto says, no. Dun dun dun. It was the Jesuits. They're always trying to kill me.
I mean, but like, how does he know? Did he see the guy? Did he talk to the guy? Did he
No, he's just constantly like.
Did he do Jesuit secret handshake?
Do you remember how John Todd was constantly supposedly getting shot at in church parking lots?
Yeah.
That. Every inconvenience in his life is the Jesuits trying to kill him.
Oh no. Was the guy, what was he getting run off the road by the Pope Mobile? That's who showed up. I got hit by the Pope Mobile. I mean, but like, if the Jesuits wanted to kill him, in Alberto's story later on, you will see that the Jesuits had many opportunities to off this guy if they wanted to, but it's just wild to me that like clear that their attempted assassination is like, let's get some rando to crash their car into his car and maybe he'll die, possibly.
Yeah,
I don't know. That seems like a good plan. Like it's very just not a good assassination attempt plan.
Well, it's also not clear if Chick is claiming that this particular assassination attempt was real or not, because we've got fictional characters being told about it. So it starts to get a little difficult to tell, like, did this supposed car running off the road incident actually happen, or is that a part of the fictional part of the story that he's telling with Tim and Jim? Anyway, Alberto starts dropping bombshells, otherwise known as conspiracy theories presented as absolute fact. He says, well, the Catholic Church is actually run by the Jesuit general who is known as the Black Pope due to his black vestments.
So I looked this up because in the comic, Alberto's like, it's actually the Black Pope. And Jim is like, do you mean like he's like the Pope and he's a black brother? Which I guess is like the normal way, like that would be like a normal thing to say in 1980. But seeing that now is like kind of funny. But anyway, I saw it and he's like, no, the Black Pope is the head of the Jesuits. And I looked this up and apparently this is like a real thing, that the Black Pope is a real thing. And it's just what the leader of the Jesuits is called colloquially, but he doesn't run the church. He's like below the Pope in the Catholic hierarchy.
Unless you believe the conspiracy theory that he really runs the church, which is pretty common conspiracy theory. Like I said earlier, all these religious orders have an internal hierarchy, which you've probably seen in movies. So the Jesuits are the largest religious order, so the guy in charge of the Jesuits is in charge of more people in religious orders than anybody else, but that's it. The Jesuits see themselves as God's soldiers, not really in the American, like, Christian nationalism, patriot prayer kind of way, more in like an intelligentsia for Jesus, best and the brightest thinkers for Jesus, we will go anywhere and do anything for God kind of way. The thing is, because the Jesuits had a bit of military inspiration in the very beginning, and because they had this goal from the outset of attracting the best and the brightest, the rumors really quickly spread that they had nefarious intentions. And also their name sounds a little bit spookier than the other religious orders. It was believed from the very beginning that they were planning to infiltrate society and exert political and social power. So the idea that this Black Pope was telling the real Pope what to do, or that the Jesuits were trying to take over and run the whole show, this was kind of the OG conspiracy theory about the Jesuits. And I have more information on that a little bit later.
So Alberto also kind of waffles on this. He says that the comic...
Like he does on everything?
Yeah, like in the comic, he says that the Jesuits are in charge of the Vatican. And I think that the reason for this is, like, according to the conspiracy, the Jesuits have closer ties to the Illuminati than the regular Catholic Church. So if you put the Jesuits in charge of both of them, then it's easier for him to libel everyday regular Catholic parishes as servants of the same evil master as the Illuminati. However, like in the Four Horsemen comic, he has like a tree of like hierarchy. I mean, it looks like the branch of like governments, but like at the top it says the Vatican, and then below that he's got the Illuminati and he's got the Jesuits as like separate things that are like on the same level. He just isn't consistent with
it's
this.
A spaghetti at the wall conspiracy theory. So now we're going to flash back to Alberto's story now that he's dropped a few truth bombs on Tim and Jim there. So after the death of his mother, he went back to seminary with his faith shaken. His mother trusted the church. She believed in all the teachings, and yet she, quote, went out screaming into a Christless eternity with a look of horror on her face. That's pretty brutal.
Yikes.
So after Alberto returned to school, one night... very, very quick trigger warning for a mention of attempted sexual assault. After Alberto returned to school, one night another seminary student climbed into bed with Alberto and tried to kiss him. Alberto punched the guy. He yells for the priest in charge of the school. And when the priest arrives, Alberto told him what happened, and the priest ordered him to get on your knees for confession.
Ugh.
That's it. This is not how confession works. The priest yells at him for rejecting the other student's love. Alberto then claims that he personally witnessed homosexuality at every level of the Catholic Church, all the way up to cardinals. He blames this on the vows of celibacy that are taken by people in holy orders and in religious life. This is an interesting little sidebar. So Tim, beefy boy, asks Alberto, I've heard some old wives' tales about workmen digging on Catholic property and uncovering hidden underground burial sites. They found baby skeletons, supposedly from nuns who had become pregnant. Is there any truth in that? Alberto responds, oh yes, that is true. It happened in Seville, Spain around 1934. Also, a discovery was made in Madrid in 1932, and another in the Basque region of northern Spain. The governments of Presidents Aznar and Manuel Azana demanded a national investigation be made of all monasteries, convents, Roman Catholic schools, and church buildings.
Was that true?
I was not able to turn up online whether or not that happened. Whether, because the fact checkable part is, did the government of President Aznar or President Azana demand a national investigation?
Which you're not finding.
I'm turning up every permutation of Google that I could think of turned up articles in Spanish, and that couldn't be run through Google Translate. I read Spanish on a very, very basic level. So if it's like a children's book, I can probably get the basics. I can't read like a newspaper article or a scholarly paper in Spanish and be able to understand it.
I blame ACE.
I did take ACE Spanish. It was miserable. So I wasn't able to get a hard confirmation on that. The comic shows a little drawing of how a convent and a monastery were basically across the street from each other, and there was a little tunnel beneath them, and there were like little aborted babies in the tunnels. Like there's a diagram. No, there's no source or like proof or anything. I bring it up because I do think it's interesting that we were hearing the same stories about the tunnels under Hyles-Anderson. Like, there was a long-standing rumor that there were, like, monks and nuns that lived in the Hyles-Anderson building when it belonged to the Catholic Church, and that some of them had secret babies and buried them in the tunnels, and that's why Jack Hyles had to do an exorcism on the whole place before they could make a college out of it. Anyway.
I mean, it probably came from Jack Chick.
I wonder, like, what's the chicken or the egg here? So back in seminary, Alberto reads the Bible in secret. He claimed in the comic that seminary students were not allowed to read the Bible unsupervised. It's definitely true that there were times in history when Catholics were discouraged or even banned from reading the Bible personally. It's also true that Catholics don't have as strong a tradition of personal Bible reading as a lot of Protestant denominations. I don't have evidence to support that a seminarian specifically would be outright banned from reading the Bible. Alberto got kicked out of class for questioning the leader's interpretation that Peter means sand, so Peter could not be the rock on which Jesus built his church. The teacher rips him a new one, kicks him out in front of the whole class, and then later he calls Alberto into his office, and the teacher reveals that he secretly agrees with Alberto. The teacher says, "I had to protect myself, although I agree with what you said. I could never let my students know what I really believe." So this is really important because Alberto is going to record multiple instances, multiple claims that someone higher up than him in the church admitted to him as a young person, as a student, "Oh, it's okay. I don't really believe it either. You don't have to really believe it. We just all have to work for the cause," kind of things that people were saying to him. And this is really going to come together down the line in this story, why those are the instances that he is reporting in this comic. The hypocrisy that he's seeing really bugs Alberto. He learns in seminary that the Jesuits did the Inquisition, and I want to directly quote this because we're going to fact check this. Quote, "The Holy Office which ran the Inquisition was run by Dominican monks, but the masterminds behind them were Jesuits."
So I went into the annals of history to fact check this to see whether or not this was true. Here's the story of the Inquisition. Basically, in order to maintain control and stamp out what they believed to be heresy, the Roman Catholic Church would have what they called inquisitions. Essentially, the Inquisition was a system of tribunal religious courts that had their own officers and that would work in tandem with monarchies and regents to preserve the power of the church in whatever locality that they were. So be it France, Spain, Italy, wherever. An inquisition would be basically set up by the monarch or a regent or it could be set up by the church. And it was basically church and state coming together to enforce church doctrines as law. The earliest inquisitions were in the 12th century, and there were inquisitions in Italy, France, Portugal. Most famous one was in Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was legendary for its brutality. So Alberto Rivera claims that the Jesuits created the Spanish Inquisition in order to fight against the Protestant Reformation. But this is impossible because the Spanish Inquisition began in 1478, a full 39 years prior to Martin Luther starting the Protestant Reformation, and 62 years before the founding of the Jesuits. So the order of events is completely out of order. So it's first the Inquisition, then the Reformation, then the Jesuits. Undoubtedly, because the Inquisition lasted for hundreds of years, there were Jesuits who were involved with the Inquisition, but to say that they founded the Inquisition is like when people say that Taylor Swift invented feminism. The Inquisition itself was enacted by the Spanish monarchy in order to uphold Catholic power in Spain and essentially to be a cudgel to wield against political dissidents and religious minorities by accusing them of heresy. Him saying it was the Jesuits that were doing the Spanish Inquisition is, or that did the Spanish Inquisition, is just blatantly false. And that's so easy, like any history book would tell you that that's wrong.
Right, but the Jesuits wrote the history books to make everybody think that the Catholic Church is A-okay and they're just a different kind of Christian and they can follow their own type of Christianity and they'll still go to heaven. And then that's how the devil tricked a billion people into going to hell.
Including Alberto Rivera's mother.
Just to be clear, we are not trying to excuse the Inquisition. We are just pointing out that historically the Jesuits did not start it because they weren't there when it started. So this is we are going to talk about a story that is similar to something you would find in Fox's Book of Martyrs. I'm going to skip the graphic torture details on this one. But heads up, the comic goes into the story of Donna Isabella, who was pregnant and in the early phase of labor while worshiping in a secret meeting on May 21st, 1559, when she was arrested by the Holy Office, which is the office that was responsible for the Inquisition in Spain. The comic gives a very detailed description of her torture. It is quite graphic. Donna Isabella says in the tribunal, as she's being tried for being a heretic, she says, "Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." And the Catholic tribunal priest yells back at her, "Stop, heretic. The Virgin Mary said that. You liar. It was the Holy Mother who said that, not Jesus. She is the way, not Jesus. Put her to death." And Donna Isabella gets burned at the stake.
Is this a real story or not? This sounds kind of fake.
So that's a good question. And this is probably the deepest rabbit hole I have ever gone on for this podcast. So buckle up. So I want to address there's two parts of this that can be fact checked. The first part is the Jesus didn't say that, Mary said that. Because I think that definitely caught the ear of anyone who has Fundy experience, because we would have memorized the scripture verse where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And I wanted to track down that part first. It turns out in an old version of the Divine Office, there is a scripture reading where Mary says, "In me is the way, the truth, and the life." This is an extra canonical book that was provided to people in holy orders or religious life around the time of the story that we're talking about. And that extra biblical, extra canonical book does quote the Virgin Mary as saying, "In me is the way, the truth, and the life." However, the most common interpretation of Mary's words there is she is saying, "I gave birth to the Son of God." Like literally inside my body is the way, the truth, and the life. Because the way, the truth, and the life is inside me right now.
So if you squint and look at it sideways and try to be as bad faith as possible, you could interpret it this way. If you really wanted to.
And then misquote what Mary may or may not have said in this extra canonical, extra biblical book. Right. So it is possible that if this story were real, an inquisitor might have misquoted this prayer book and said this to Donna Isabella during her tribunal trial. It is absolutely possible, because an inquisitor would have been most likely a Dominican monk or could have been a priest, and both monks and priests would have had access to that version of the Divine Office that has that quote from Mary.
The other thing about this is that the Inquisition was as much a political body as it was a religious one. So if there was somebody who was deemed to be a possible political problem, then they could basically reach into whatever bag of contradictions that they wanted to reach into to find a potential heresy that this person had committed in order to get them. And in order to...
Absolutely. So this could have, if this story happened, it is surely possible that Donna Isabella quoted scripture and this inquisitor turned her words on their side against her in bad faith, as well as he could have just made a mistake. However, I'm really not convinced that the story itself is real about the martyrdom of Donna Isabella. I googled Donna Isabella 1559 martyr. The only things that came up share a source with this comic or are sourced directly from this comic.
Interesting.
Confirms absolutely nothing. So then I pulled up a full text of Fox's Book of Martyrs, which really fucking triggered me. That was fun.
Should we do an episode on this one?
You know, now that I've desensitized myself to it recently, maybe we should. That'd probably be good. It's a good Halloween-y kind of topic. So once I got over the trigger, I keyword searched Fox's Book of Martyrs for a lot of different things. I looked up Donna Isabella, I looked up Donna, I looked up Isabella, I looked up burned. I read through every single instance of the word burned or burn in Fox's Book of Martyrs, found nothing. I looked up 1559, found nothing. So obviously Fox's Book of Martyrs doesn't include every single person who was ever martyred, but it's a pretty solid source for all of the ones that most people know about. For sure. There's a key fact presented in this comic that we haven't yet mentioned. The comic says that Donna Isabella was the cousin of King Philip II of Spain. And it goes so far as to say that King Philip II attended her execution and was happy to see it. Like, he enjoyed her execution because he was happy to see another heretic die.
They all, like, all of the royalty during that time were all killing each other because they're like, I want to stamp out any potential claims to the throne that could have a motive to come after me.
Right. So this is where I got into the deepest rabbit hole that I have ever been down on this sorry, Jen, rabbit trail? Anyway, I looked into the ancestry of King Philip II of Spain, and I spent a good deal more time than I should have on this. He was a Habsburg, so literally anybody in Europe could have been his cousin. But this comic is written for an American audience. It does not specify that Donna Isabella was anything other than his first cousin. So I'm going to assume that it means his first cousin. I'm going to look at all of his first cousins. Philip II of Spain was descended from Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, Archduke of Austria, and his wife, Isabella of Portugal. So if Donna Isabella was his cousin, she is either the daughter of one of Charles V's brothers or sisters, or the daughter of one of Isabella's brothers or sisters, right?
Stands to reason.
Charles V was descended from Philip I, King of Castile, aka Philip the Handsome, who had 6 children: Eleanor, Charles, Isabella, Ferdinand, Mary, and Catherine. All 6 except for Mary, so 5 out of those 6 children had children of their own. In fact, Ferdinand had 15 children. May have been an early fundamentalist. But none of those children were named Isabella, except a daughter of Catherine, who died at only 1 year old. All of these people were related to each other. All of them have the same names. Most of them died young. But there are no cousins named Isabella on his father's side. So the cousin would have to be on Philip II's mother's side. So Isabella of Portugal's siblings, children. Isabella of Portugal's mother and father were King Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon. Isabella had 7 siblings who lived into adulthood. 2 of them are ruled out because they became priests and later cardinals in the Catholic Church. And none of the other 5 had a child named Isabella, which is kind of extremely unlikely because all of these people have the same names as each other because they're all named after each other, and there were several Isabellas who married into the family. But Philip II did not have a cousin named Isabella. And just to double check, I also went through all of his nieces and nephews because all of these people are related multiple ways, and none of his brothers or sisters had surviving children named Isabella.
So there would be nobody who could possibly be a threat to the line of succession whose name was Isabella, or who could... And also, it's a woman, so she wouldn't be a threat to the line of succession anyway. She would be somebody that you would want because then you could marry her off to somebody else for a political alliance or whatever.
But I cannot find any record of this person existing.
Does Alberto say where he got this story from? I'm wondering if this is just like a myth or an urban legend, or if this is one of those things that he claims that he pulled out. Like, because he says later in the comics that the Vatican has like this place in their basement with like the records of everything. Like, so I don't know if he's got like this story and he found it next to the binder where they have all the nuclear codes in it. You know, or like the real story of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa and like the...
No, he doesn't give us a source for this. I spent way too much time on this and almost made our episode publication date late because of this. This one really stuck in my head because she's not in Fox's Book of Martyrs. I cannot find her in any secular historical records. I was even on some genealogy websites looking for her, could not find her. I could not find any evidence that such a person ever existed. Why would Alberto make up a whole new person for this comic instead of just using one of the hundreds of stories from Fox's Book of Martyrs?
Because he's kind of lazy. I don't know. That's like honestly my take is that this is a dude who, and we know he's a liar, and we'll get into how we know he's a liar later in this episode. But the reason why you would be this kind of grifter is if you didn't want to get like a fucking actual job and work and do real things that, you know what I'm saying? Or if you don't want to get a job. Or
just like sustain yourself, because like the idea that we all have to be a benefit to society is not really necessary, because some people just need to like live their life and sustain themselves. And that's fine. Be a good person, live your life, take care of your family. But Alberto was none of those things.
You know, if you're working like a wage job, what you're doing is you're renting out your time, but he doesn't want to fucking do that. He just wants to go around the country and have people cheer for him and stand on stage and say a bunch of that he made up and not actually do any work and have all of his things in his life taken care of by somebody else because he doesn't want to take personal responsibility for anything that's going on. And that's the reason why you become this sort of grifter. Right.
But in order to make all of that happen, he has to set himself up to be a really big shot.
Yeah.
And that's where we get into his spy. So I think it would be a good time to go take up the offering. And when we come back, we can talk about Alberto's spy.
Sounds good. Hey, listeners, we're going to take a week or two off before we come back with part 2. I'll see if I can come up with a bonus episode to release in the meantime, but we will be back in a couple weeks to drop part 2 of our Alberto Rivera episode. And then we'll finish off the Summer of Satan, be ready to go with our 3rd anniversary episode. We're really excited to show you guys what we have coming in the fall. You're not going to want to miss it. It's going to be a lot of fun. Can't wait to show it to you guys.
Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
We are back from our break. We talked about the first part of Alberto's story, and some of his claims in the first part of his story, none of which are true. All of it is false. Every single piece of this is completely made up, including the part that we're about to get into, where Alberto Rivera claims that he's like a secret agent for the Vatican, but like an evil
international super spy.
Dun, 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 dun. He works for the KGB. Actually, the KGB work for the Soviet Union, who work for the Vatican. You heard it here first. So
you heard it here second.
This is Alberto's story. This is the continuation. So when he was 14, Alberto claims that he began training to infiltrate Protestant churches. His bosses taught him how to blend in these churches, and over the course of time, he infiltrated hundreds of churches. Alberto was specifically trained to infiltrate into Plymouth Brethren, Pentecostals, Baptists, and United Evangelicals.
So how this would work when he was still in seminary in Spain is that he would be provided with names of people who weren't showing up at Mass, because the priests would make a list of like people who used to come to Mass and didn't anymore and turn them into the government. And then the government would turn them into the Jesuits, and then Alberto would get a list of these names. He would be assigned to meet them, like a planned meet cute kind of thing, get invited to dinner, ingratiate himself to the family, and then get invited to their church. once he got to the church, he would get super involved at this secret underground church and get everyone's names and then turn them in to the Spanish government, who would raid the church and arrest everyone.
The premise for their raids is that the Spanish Inquisition never actually ended, and that it's still operating in secret, and religions that aren't Catholicism are illegal in Spain, which was not the case. Like, it wasn't illegal to not be Catholic in Spain. This is in like the 1960s. I did a deep dive into this. Yeah, loony. But basically, he has to get in, get the trust of the ministry, rat people out. And he says that he did this to at least 19 churches in Spain. On one occasion, he even allowed himself intentionally to be caught by the police so that his name would appear in the paper as a heretic, and so that other churches that he infiltrated would know that he was trustworthy.
So his base claim here is that Catholicism was, quote, the only religion allowed in Spain. This is definitely true about a large period of time from the 1500s all the way into the 1800s, believe it or not.
Oh, I believe it.
Although
it's Spain.
The Inquisition had cooled down considerably by the 1800s, but the last death formally attributed to the Inquisition in Spain was in fact in 1826. So not even quite 200 years ago now. In 1834, the Inquisition was formally ended by royal decree, and in 1851, Catholicism became the Spanish state religion. How the state religion thing worked was the government heavily subsidized things like priests' salaries and upkeep on Catholic buildings. This practice ended in 1931, but was reestablished 5 years later and continued going along like that until it all fell apart after Vatican II.
But the religions that were not Catholicism were not illegal at that time.
No. I did find out exactly what the rules were. So Alberto claims that he was 14 when he started doing this.
Yeah.
So we are looking around 1949. 14 to 17 would put us in the range of 1949 to 1952. At this time, Catholicism was the only religion, was the state religion, and it was the only religion to have legal status in Spain. Other religions were not allowed to do the following things. Number 1, advertise church services. Number 2, own property. And number 3, publish books. It was not in any way illegal to believe or practice a religion other than Catholicism. It was not illegal to hold church services. Although any religion other than Catholicism could not even meet in a building that outwardly appeared to be a church. So if you were a Protestant church or a non-Christian religion who wanted to have meetings in Spain around this time, late 40s, early 50s, you would have to meet in a meeting, some sort of meeting hall that didn't look like a church. Like you could have a strip mall church, but you couldn't have it like Steven Anderson, but you couldn't have a church in a building that looks like a church. The Catholic Church had incredible amounts of privilege from the Spanish government. And I would even go so far to say that Protestants were persecuted. But it does not appear that Alberto's narrative of being arrested simply for practicing another religion holds up very well. Like it was bad times for Protestants, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, that seems like that's not good freedom of religion. That seems like that's a very bad situation, and those laws are unjust.
Sure.
But
I don't see like, oh, you had a secret underground church meeting and then you got raided and arrested. That didn't line up with what I found.
Yeah, they're not locking up people having a basement home church. But what he would essentially do was he was getting the names of everybody who was in the church. He says it goes to a database. I don't know if it's a computer database. I assume by the 80s it would have been a computer database because they're the Vatican and they have the latest gizmos and gadgets because they're spies. But he tells a story about how one time he and a young woman were both undercover plants in a Baptist church, and they started a rumor that the preacher was having an affair with the girl in order to divide the church. This plan was successful. The preacher's wife divorced him. The church fell apart, and Alberto and the young woman moved on to the next church. When the Catholics find out that there is a righteous man of God, the Catholics would have a 3-step plan to bring him down, where basically if the first step doesn't work, then they move on to the second step, and if the second step doesn't work, they move on to the third. The first thing that they'll try is to try to discredit him. If that doesn't work, then they'll try to isolate him, and if that doesn't work, then they'll just kill him. So the first step, what they'll do is they'll start a controversy or a scandal. They'll make a false allegation to bring him down. On one occasion, Alberto says that they planted a woman on the side of the road with car trouble, who then made a false rape allegation against the preacher who stopped to help her. This seems highly illogical and unlikely to me, like logistically very difficult to do.
Yeah, this is where we really get into like some John Todd type narrative out of Alberto.
Yeah.
I also feel incredibly icked out that he specifically calls out false allegations of rape and sexual assault as a way that they would discredit these preachers.
Very Jack Scott of him.
Very a lot of people, and that really icks me out. I did want to say, like, this reads like it could be from Hamilton. I'll read it to you. Number 1, destroy his reputation by lying about him, twisting something he said, making him look like an enemy of the country to get him in trouble with the officials, or frame him with a woman she could be planted as his secretary to have an affair with him.
Is that what Hamilton sounds like?
Kind of.
Jack Chick wrote Hamilton. The most effective, so this is the most effective strategy. If it doesn't work, then they basically, what they do is they start like a whisper campaign to get that church to, I guess, believe that he doesn't have the light of God shining through him or something.
Well, what Alberto described doing was he'd go to like half of the church members and tell them, well, you know that Catholics are really good Christians, just like everybody else. And I don't know why your pastor can't support our Catholic brothers and sisters. And then he'd go to the other half of the church and he would say, well, you know that Catholics are tools of Satan and that they're pulling people away from the true gospel. I don't understand why your pastor keeps supporting these Catholics.
That's not a very slick thing to do, especially if it's you who's doing it to everyone. They're like, wait, who said that he was supporting? Oh, it was Alberto. I thought Alberto was the one like, you're not slick if you do that.
Okay, but these people can't text, so they don't have like screenshots and receipts of everything.
Yeah, but
you have to cut them a little bit of a break.
They're church people. They know each other. They'll be like, who said that to you,
True.
Alberto? Oh, Alberto said it to me.
Kid.
The new kid. The guy that just showed up last week. What are we doing here?
Right.
This guy's been our pastor for 15 years, and Alberto showed up a week ago, and he starts making allegations and stuff and being crazy. And as soon as he showed up, wild stuff started happening. I don't trust this guy. I think he's an op. If this doesn't work, then they'll basically their last resort is to kill him, and they'll go out of their way to make it look random. So they might make it look like a mugging gone wrong or a car crash, or they might pull some strings to get him put in a mental hospital and then kill him with drugs, a la like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah, a couple things. I noticed while we were talking about this that Alberto is portraying these, Bible-believing real Christians in Spain as being very naive. He's portraying them as being easily misled by a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kid.
Yeah, he's literally a teenager.
I think that's a tactic, because who is this book meant to be sold to?
I didn't even think of that, dude.
Real Bible-believing Christians in the U.S. His grift is, you are getting fooled, and this is how you're getting fooled. Wake up. Be smarter than these people whose churches I raided, whose churches I took down. Now you're in on it. Now you're smarter. Now you're better than these people.
So it's basically just running interference for all of the abusive pastors that are out there that could prompt people to leave or prompt churches to blow up when somebody does something.
Yeah, but also that it's a sales tactic, like to make making the buyer feel good about themselves is the biggest sales tactic there is. He's like, you are a real Bible-believing church member, but you're smarter than these people in Spain, because look how easily I misled all of these churches. But now you have this information, and now you're better than them and smarter than them, and you're not going to get misled by the secret Jesuits in your church.
That's a really smart observation, though.
I didn't notice it like 3 times through the comic to write notes for this episode, and I didn't notice it until now. So it also just plays right into the IFB narrative about pastors.
Yeah, I mean, I can see Jack Scott's defense, because this is a teenage girl. He could be saying that girl was a plant.
She was a Jesuit plant.
She was a Jesuit plant. Nothing that she's saying is true. Or she found me in a moment of weakness, and that's when she chose to strike. It's not my fault. I was set up. And people are going to be like, "That's I read that in the comic book. That's true. That's real." Oh, man.
Yeah, if someone accuses your pastor of having an affair, she's probably a Catholic plant. And he might not even have fallen for her seduction. She could just be lying. And it plays right into the existing IFB narrative of like, don't ruin his ministry.
That's insidious. So Alberto went undercover to an interdenominational Bible college in Costa Rica with 2 women, Carmen and Marie. Carmen was to be his girlfriend, and Marie was to be a single woman who would use her feminine wiles to corrupt the young men of the Bible college. Alberto went to the college and was successful convincing everyone he was anti-Catholic by fighting very publicly with his Jesuit priests. Of course, they were like in on it. So they know to like, duke it out with him verbally, at least.
Right.
He would cause a commotion on campus by holding hands with his girlfriend in order to influence people to challenge the dating rules and therefore have a downfall of morality. He also fought with the pastors, fought with the administrators, was generally a troublemaker. Meanwhile, Marie managed to seduce 17 students and then managed to get them expelled, as well as 3 pastors, which is funny because to me, if you're a professor and you're being seduced by a student, then you should lose your job. But they act like, oh, the men, the pastor, they all have no agency here. It's like
that's the fundy narrative, isn't it? Like, men are the strong leaders. They are the ones with the true moral compass from God, and women are meant to be followers and let men make all the decisions. But men are also absolutely powerless against a Jezebel woman, a seductive woman. Men are completely incapable of resisting powerful temptation.
I wonder if Bob Larson went to Marie, how many Jezebel demons she would have.
Oh, probably a lot of Jezebel demons.
Yeah.
He'd have to do like 14 exorcisms. Yeah. I'm not going to get on my soapbox today, even though I want to, because my baby is probably not going to sleep much longer. But it infantilizes women and takes women's agency by saying that men are the powerful, strong leaders and the only ones who get real messages from God, and you always have to be a follower. And then it turns around and bites men too, because men are incapable of resisting any kind of advances from a woman, or even just a beautiful woman. So it is a vicious cycle that takes everybody's agency. Alberto says that he and his cronies were able to cause so much division and upset at this interdenominational Bible college that it was on the verge of closing. He said he led a 3-day hunger strike among the students that made the news. And the administration wanted to kick him out, get him out of the country, because his visa to be in Costa Rica was tied to being at this Bible college. So if they could revoke the visa, then he would have to go back to Spain. So the Vatican got with the government of Spain, and the Vatican told the government of Spain to say that Alberto was an army deserter, so that then he would leave the college and get him back to Spain quickly so that the school wouldn't find out that he was a Jesuit infiltrator all along.
This doesn't make any sense. Does
this seem completely unnecessary when he could have just waited for the college to kick him out of the country?
Yeah, or he could have just literally said, I'm done with this place. This place doesn't have any morality to it. I'm going home. I'm flying back to Spain, and gotten on a plane and done it, and no one would have been the wiser.
Right. Also, he didn't leave Costa Rica, which I can prove, and we'll get to that. But I just put a pin in the whole Vatican got me out of the country by claiming I was an army deserter thing, because I am going to circle back around to that in a minute.
So he also says that the Catholic Church says that Mary was also immaculately conceived and therefore that she was co-equal with God, and that this is necessary for them to trick people into worshiping Mary and viewing her as their ticket to salvation rather than Jesus. This way people won't go to heaven and the devil will win. This is wild to me. I read this and I'm not aware of any of these like Catholic Mary conspiracies. There are these like...
So this is actually a half truth.
Huh.
So the true part is the Immaculate Conception of Mary. And this is a Catholic doctrine that I struggle with, but not as much as I struggle with others, which means it's incredibly interesting to me. Because when I feel a conflict or a struggle, like that's the good part for me. So the teaching is that Mary was conceived in the natural way by a human mother and a human father. Unlike Jesus, who was conceived supernaturally from a human mother without a human father. But Mary was divinely preserved from sin from the moment of conception. So Mary has fully human DNA, but she has never sinned and was never touched by the Adam's curse of sin, even from the time she was an embryo. Because Jesus is considered in Catholic doctrine to have been born from a human egg, but no sperm. So the egg that made Jesus, which was originally part of Mary's body, would have to be genetically sinless in order for Jesus to be genetically sinless. Because the Christian teaching as a whole, as an oversimplification, is that sin is genetic, like literally in your DNA.
Sadie, this is what I mean when I say that Christians just be like making up. It's like
the problem with taking religion seriously is that the more you take religion seriously, the more you have to take it seriously.
I'm just like, this seems fake. That seems, the more I learn about the Christian doctrines, I'm just like, yeah, this seems made up as No offense to any Christians out here, but like,
well, to people like me, this, leads me to not into more trying to figure out how it works scientifically or scripturally. It leads me more into a respect for the mysteries of religion that I don't understand. Like, I don't feel the need to go thinking about Jesus's DNA. It's more of like, oh, that's holy. Like, oh, that's something that I don't need to understand for me. So that part is true anyway, that Mary was conceived without sin and preserved from sin for her entire life and never sinned. The lie, of course, is that the church purposely came up with this doctrine to make Mary co-equal with God and trick people into seeing her as their ticket to heaven instead of Jesus. The doctrine is not that she is co-equal with God or with Jesus. It's more like she was a human being and she did God the biggest favor ever. And also she did me a favor because she brought Jesus into the world, who is the connection point for God's grace getting to me as a human being. So we would all consider her our spiritual mother because she birthed salvation incarnate. Salvation comes from God through Jesus because of his sacrifice. But there is a human being who is physically and spiritually responsible for Jesus getting here so that he could give us the grace through his sacrifice. So we should probably all be really nice to her. But Catholic doctrine does not elevate Mary to a position within the Trinity, nor does it make her a demigod or a figure of divinity, although it does elevate her to a very high position spiritually.
Okay.
That's going to be interesting to half the audience. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. After completing his missions, Alberto was invited to the Vatican, where he attended a secret black mass with the Black Pope. Dun, dun, dun. Black Pope was wearing a Masonic ring. Also, dun, dun, dun. Alberto realized that the Masons had been the Catholics all along. And he was scheduled.
Doesn't fit with any John Todd or anybody else.
He was scheduled to speak at a meeting of Latin Protestants in Guatemala, and in front of the crowd during his speech, he spilled the beans and said that he'd lied to everybody. And then the Catholics kidnapped him and locked him in a padded room with a straitjacket and found him guilty of heresy. Then they tortured him and left him without food or water, and he was kept in an iron lung because his body basically just stopped working because he was starved and tortured. Everything changed when he asked Jesus to forgive him for everything that he had done, and he suddenly felt a burst of strength and was able to use this strength to escape from the iron lung. He was sent back to Madrid, and the Jesuits tried to reprogram him, but they were unsuccessful. Alberto left Spain and left the Catholic Church for good, and ever since then, he's been on the Vatican/Jesuit hit list. They've tried to kill him in many ways, and they've also tried to make it look like an accident. They've tried to poison him. They've tried to crash a car into him. They've tried to kidnap him, but they have not been successful.
There's a few things to fact check here. Let's start with the easy one, shall we?
Yeah.
So Alberto said that they had him kept, so they took him to, I would say an asylum might be a good way to describe it. I'm trying to look at exactly what he calls it.
He's like in a like the Vatican. He's like in a basement in Madrid somewhere, in like some church basement, I guess, next to the ping pong table and like the basketball hoops and the billiard table. Youth group is meeting next door. They're singing songs with the guitar.
He says it's a secret place for priests who have gone insane. So he's implying that there are others like him who wanted to leave the church, and that if you wanted to get out of the Catholic priesthood, that they would kidnap you and take you to the secret place in Barcelona and like reprogram you. So here's the thing. He says that at this asylum, they keep him in an iron lung, and he was able to escape because Jesus gave him a burst of strength. So I'm pretty familiar with iron lungs because one of my dad's best friends later in life was in an iron lung as a kid, and he wrote a book about it. Monty Watts. For those who did grow up fundamentalist, you probably have heard of this book. And I don't think so.
I quote, this is the exact quote from the book as Alberto says it. He says, "I climbed out of the iron lung and removed the tubes from my body." The guy sees in the hallway, he like gets out of the iron lung and he's walking down the hallway. Guy looks at him and says, "Who took you out of the iron lung?" And Alberto responds, "Jesus did. He's given me life."
So to start with, iron lungs don't have tubes inherent to the device. I'm not sure what tubes he would be referring to that he removed from his body.
You can't just like pull a catheter out, can you?
Depends on what kind.
Ugh.
So iron lungs work on negative pressure. For those who weren't familiar with the device, it kind of looks like that submersible thing that imploded, but it's a sealed container. On one end, there's a hole that a person's head goes through and a gasket that seals it pretty tightly around their neck. On the other end is like a rubber diaphragm that can expand and contract. The machine will create a vacuum inside the machine, lowers a semi-vacuum, lowers the pressure inside the machine. That pressure low forces the person's lungs to expand and draw in air through the person's mouth and nose, which are outside the machine. So it manually expands your lungs for you so that you breathe in. Then the machine will blow air back into itself. The machine raises the pressure inside, which gently compresses the person's lungs, forcing them to breathe out through their mouth and nose, which are outside the machine.
We don't use them anymore now because we have ventilators.
Right. It is a precursor to a ventilator. It saved a lot of people's lives during polio, and from other diseases, but it is a manual breathing machine that forces a person's lungs to breathe in and out. And the whole thing works because it is a sealed container. They were typically used for people who were experiencing some type of paralysis, including full body paralysis or nearly so. I was not able to find a schematic of iron lungs because I was still burned out from researching the entire Habsburg family tree, but I don't see why there would be a handle on the inside of a machine that is intended for somebody who can't move their own body. I don't think there's a way for somebody to get out of an iron lung on their own. I don't think that if it's sealed, there's got to be a lock, and the lock would not be on the inside because of who it is intended to be used for.
I'm just assuming that Jesus gave him power and he just like turned into the Incredible Hulk and was just like, raw.
So Jesus gave him strength to Hulk smash out of an iron lung. Is that what he is saying here?
He says, Jesus gave me life. And I assume that it's just like Jesus was like.
Or did Jesus just like come in like, hey, bro, I got you, and like flip the locks on this thing?
Yeah. But because he was in there because he had been tortured so bad that he couldn't breathe anymore, and that he'd been like starved and left without water. So I assume that also maybe the tubes could have been for like IV fluids or something. I don't know.
Yeah, but you can't have an IV inside an iron lung. Like, if you know how an IV bag works and you know how an iron lung works, they are incompatible. The iron lung works on pressure. So if you were running an IV tube into there, you'd be messing up the air pressure that makes the iron lung work.
Well, maybe they just put it into his neck. I don't know.
That would be the only way it would work, and then that's like, ugh,
and his
can't do that.
Face and neck didn't have anything going into or on them on the picture that Fred Carter drew in the book. So
I cannot prove that he is lying about this, but I can tell you it is extremely implausible, and I do not believe this part of his story.
There is a 0% chance that this is real. There is like a negative, like if there was the odds on it, it would be like minus 1,000 is the odds on this. Like, I don't even know, like, where did he come up with this? I guess he was just assuming that nobody who was reading this would have ever been near or around an iron lung before. Either that, or maybe it's just like the kind of thing where if you're doubting his story, where he just like keeps coming up with crazier and crazier things and saying, Jesus, let me do this thing. And if you doubt the first one, then you're probably going to not believe the ones that came after it. But if you believe the first one, then the second one is slightly crazier. And you get to the point where you're just like, well, I believe that Jesus can do anything. So why couldn't he do this? And if you doubt him, then you're doubting the power of Jesus.
I also want to look at this thing in Guatemala in 1965. So reading directly from the comic Alberto, quote, "By this time I was destroyed. My hope was gone. I was on tranquilizers. I was to speak before an ecumenical meeting of Latin Protestant leaders and Roman Catholics in Guatemala. There were to be 50,000 people in the stadium. I committed an unpardonable sin. I exposed what Rome was up to." So according to Alberto, he got up on the stage and confessed to infiltrating churches and framing pastors. He told 50,000 people that the love gospel and the acceptance of Catholics was going to lead people straight to hell, and that the Catholic Church was a false religion.
Wow. I can't imagine that the Catholic leaders were too pleased about that.
Yeah, so this is how he got shipped off to the place for priests who have lost their minds in Barcelona to attempt to reprogram him. So I don't think I'm going to be able to find any information about this exact event. A problem that I've run into a couple times researching this episode is that newspapers that would be relevant to what I need are in Spanish, and I don't read Spanish on like a newspaper level. I would like to know, though, I think I can track down whether or not it's plausible that this event could have possibly happened. So I looked up all of the stadiums in Guatemala and sorted them by the years that they were built and filtered for only stadiums that will hold more than 50,000 people. And what I found, and this and the Habsburg stuff are like the weirdest research I've ever done for this podcast, and it was extremely enjoyable.
I know how much you love doing this, like really. I mean, this is getting to like Paul Sand, me looking up like high school yearbooks and football schedules.
This is Paul Sand level.
Yeah.
For sure. So, turns out
There's only one stadium in Guatemala that ever held 50,000 people. And please excuse my accent, it's Estadio Nacional Doroteo Guamach Flores. It is the largest stadium in Guatemala. It is in Guatemala City. It's also been used for like national games, like pre-Olympics tryout stuff. It was built in 1946, and it's the only stadium anywhere close to big enough that was built before 1965. Now the stadium has a capacity of 26,000 people with plastic seats, but when it was originally built, it could fit 50,000 people on wooden benches. And that was the only stadium in Guatemala at the time that would hold that many people. So if it happened in this stadium. There was a civil war going on in Guatemala at the time. Yeah, at the time that he claims this thing happened. But the fighting does not... I looked up like the places that the fighting was happening during the year of 1965, and the fighting does not seem to have been centered on Guatemala City. Guatemala City had like minor clashes, but the main actual war was not there. So, let's continue. There was definitely a Pentecostal movement in Guatemala in the 1960s. There was a Protestant movement as a whole. I was not able to find anything about any large ecumenical conferences that were held. But again, if there was a news report on this, it would probably be in Spanish and be harder for me to find. I did turn up several large ecumenical organizations that have been doing work in Guatemala since the 1960s. I did also see that the Catholic Church was quote-unquote suppressed in Guatemala in the 1960s by anti-communist governments, because the anti-communist governments thought that the Catholic Church was associated with Marxism. So it was like slightly less of a good time for the Catholic Church in Guatemala in the mid-60s. There was absolutely a Protestant, like growth in the Protestant church going on. The capital was not directly involved in the Civil War in 1965. So an event like the 50,000 member ecumenical conference that Alberto describes is not impossible. The only caveat is it would absolutely have to have been held at Estadio Nacional Doroteo Guamach Flores. That's the only place it could have been.
Yeah, but right now, him saying, I spoke at an ecumenical conference in Guatemala in 1965, that's not like a crazy thing for him to say.
No, not at all. Like this is possible. So I want you to hold on to that information, because Alberto is going, when we get to the proof that he provides in Jack Chick's book, we're going to come back to this and his supposed proof for this thing happening. So you were saying, let's like finish up his story and then we'll do his proof, okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, you were saying that the Jesuits somehow just let him leave the country, but they've like been hot on his trail and trying to kill him ever since.
So he busted out of the iron lung. Basically, from there, he was able to get out of the Jesuits' control. And he says that he left Spain with 40 cents in his pocket. And at this point, that's when this section of the comic ends, and he doesn't quite say what he got up to next. He just says, I left Spain with 40 cents in my pocket.
So the next comic, Double Cross, like deals with what happened. Like it picks up exactly where Alberto leaves off. Alberto says that he has a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. and 40 cents in his pocket. But while he was in the airport in Madrid, about to leave to go to D.C., he made a call to his sister. His sister was a nun in a convent in London, and she is frantic and crying and says that she has attempted to end her own life 3 times. So while he is on the phone with her, he missed his flight to DC. And there was only one other flight out of Spain that night. And it just so happened that that flight was to London, because it was God's will. So he got on the plane to London. My first question is, how did he buy a plane ticket to London with 40 cents? Like, I know inflation is a thing, but I don't buy that. And this is too early for credit cards.
What he says is that he said, I left Spain with 40 cents in my pocket. So I assume that that's just like all he had. Like he bought a plane ticket and he's like, okay, I got like $100 or something left. And then he's like, oh crap, now I got to buy this different plane ticket. Now I only have 40 cents.
Okay, so Jesus miraculously gave him the exact amount of money he needed to get on the flight to London.
That's my charitable interpretation of what he's saying here, yes.
I want to talk about his rescue of his sister next week in part 2.
because I think the end of the Alberto comic is a good time to look at the proof that he offers, which is not great, and the inconsistencies in his story that we haven't covered so far. Here's the thing. Alberto claims that he was born in Spain, Canary Islands, Spain. He went to Jesuit seminary at a young age. He was infiltrating Bible-believing churches in Spain at age 14. And then when he was 17, he went to do the same thing in Venezuela. And then he went to seminary in Costa Rica, where he tried to mess up this Bible college. So he was born September 19th, 1935. So Alberto is saying that he was infiltrating churches in Spain around 1949 to 1952. Then he went to Venezuela around 1952, and then he was in Costa Rica around 1953-ish. And then he was in the church, in the Catholic Church, for another 12 years before blowing the whole thing at the Giant Stadium Conference in 1965, when he would have been 30 years old. But he didn't fully leave Catholicism until 1967. He does give us the exact date on that as September 18th, 1967.
Okay.
So should we just start with the fact that he was in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1965?
Really?
Yep.
Well, I mean,
he has arrest records, arrest warrants and lawsuits for fraud in New Jersey in 1965.
Well, everybody knows that New Jersey belongs to the Italians and the Jews, and therefore it is clearly a Vatican/Illuminati fortress and stronghold. So those arrest records were clearly faked by the Vatican and the Illuminati, who have control of the government of the state of New Jersey.
Yes. Exactly. So we'll get more into New Jersey, because Alberto did provide some documentation on his travels between Spain and Central South America.
How legit is his documentation?
This documentation is as legit as a lot of documentation that we would see from this era. For example, I have my great-grandmother's official ID card from the 1960s in Alabama. It's just a handwritten card. There's no photo of her. You just went to the DMV or whatever, and they gave you an official card, and you just took a pen and wrote your name and phone number and address on it, and that's your ID card. That's it.
Wow.
So his documentation is at least as legit as that. I'm looking at the things we have, and you don't know Jack. We have a visa that gives Alberto permission to leave Spain in 1955, and a statement from around that same time stating that he is not an army deserter and has a good civil record. We also have a letter from the head of the seminary that Alberto attended, basically asking permission for him to leave Spain to go to college there. And this is where we finally get the name of the seminary. Alberto does not give it to us in the comic book, but the seminary is Seminario Biblico Latinoamerico in San Jose, Costa Rica. So these letters, assuming that they're real, they do show that Alberto was at the seminary in Costa Rica around 1955. This does give us a little problem of 2 missing years between when he was published as a heretic in the paper when the house church he was involved with got raided. Because he said he was 17, that would have to happen in late 1952 to early 1953. But I think, given multiple pieces of evidence, we can assume that he was in Costa Rica in 1955.
So the name of the seminar is Seminario Biblico Latinoamerico, and it's in San Jose, Costa Rica. So I searched for this, and I couldn't find it. I did find a school with a similar name, which is Universidad Biblico Latinoamericano.
Oh, that could be the same school, because Bob Jones University was originally Bob Jones College. And Liberty had an early name change as well, so that could definitely be the same place.
Yeah, also Jack Chick in his comics, frequently gets the names for stuff wrong. If you read the names of stuff in the comics, I don't know if it's just back then things were, the name that we know of for something was something different, or there will be a name for something that we usually read as one word and they'll write it as 2 words. Especially if it's something that's translated from a different language, or he'll just change it, or he'll just copy it down wrong. Anyway, I checked. I don't think that this is the school that Alberto would have gone to, because I checked the school's website, and they have pages on their website about social justice and environmental justice.
Or maybe that's proof that Alberto successfully messed them up with his Catholic doctrine and the love gospel and made them stray from the word of God.
That makes sense, though, because, and we know this, is that progressive Christianity is a Catholic plot to try to trick good Bible-believing Christians into following the Illuminati.
Right. And doing evil things like loving their neighbor.
Yeah. Can't be doing that.
We have another letter from the ambassador of Spain, Jose Maria Cabanillas, telling Alberto in 1956, basically, you are no longer a deserter, come back to Spain and join the army. This letter is presented as proof that the Jesuits got Alberto out of the seminary. I'm going to quote from You Don't Know Jack. Someone at the Spanish embassy or back home in Las Palmas or somewhere wanted Alberto out of that Bible seminary. Was it before they could discover Alberto was really a Jesuit on a Jesuitical mission? The power of the Spanish military backed Alberto's recall notice. This says he was drafted. But guess what? There is no documentation that Alberto raced home to the Canary Islands at this point.
Huh.
Also, Jesuitical. That's a word.
Jesuitical. I mean, I understood what he was saying. I'm not.
He could have just said on a Jesuit mission.
I mean, it's like, it's like when I was learning to spell when I was a little kid. It was the guess and go spelling. It's that you sound out the word and you write out what you think the word sounds like, and then you come back and you fix it later. When
the fundies think guess and go spelling is evil.
Why?
Because you have to drill your children with standing and reciting words endlessly, and that's how you teach them to spell. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that trauma today. Other records the Cornerstone magazine claims to have show that Alberto was simply expelled for excessive lying and fighting with administrators and being a problem child. So this letter from the ambassador of Spain doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove what we think is true. It doesn't prove Alberto's story, because it just as well could be a draft notice that Alberto ran from by leaving the seminary and then staying in Costa Rica. It could have something to do with him being expelled. It could have nothing to do with him being expelled. This is non-proof for anything other than the fact that, yes, it's very likely that he was in Costa Rica.
I do find it interesting that John Todd was expelled for the army for the same reason that Alberto was kicked out of the seminary, was just for
there's a pattern.
Excessive lying and being unable to distinguish fact from reality.
So there is one other thing, though, about this letter that I found extremely interesting. Part of the letter reads, quote, Alberto Rivera Romero, son of Juan and Teresa, who live in this capital.
But his parents are dead.
His mom is supposedly quite dead. She went screaming into a Christless eternity, if I recall. So his mom's death is a crucial part of his story. And this letter kind of makes it seem like she was alive. I haven't found anybody else who's dug into that yet. And I had just kind of already done enough for this episode. An actual helpful piece of documentation from the book You Don't Know Jack shows that Alberto was a circuit-riding Methodist Episcopal preacher in Costa Rica in 1958. This lines up with both Alberto's story and his detractors' stories. Alberto says that he was still a Jesuit and he was going around destroying Methodist churches. Alberto's detractors say that he was a grifter and the Methodists were his current grift at the time. Pretty much everybody agrees, and we have photo evidence that Alberto was a Methodist Episcopal circuit-riding preacher in Costa Rica in 1958. So it's nice to know where he was at one point.
And it's weird to see
reassuring.
The place where he was at one point be the place where he says he was, because...
Yes. It's kind of reassuring, though, that everybody agrees on where he was exactly once in his life. It does seem that in the late 50s, while doing the Methodist Episcopal preacher thing, Alberto met his first wife, Carmen Lydia Torres. Alberto and Carmen were never legally married, but he said that God had ordained his marriage and that made it okay. Jack Scott. Here's where things get a little more obscure. Witnesses tell us that Alberto was working in the Christian Reformed Church in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1964 when his son Juan was born.
Wait, so he was a Calvinist?
He was grifting among Calvinists at the time.
Okay.
The Reverend Edson Lewis was a supervisor of his at the time, and he testified that Alberto was physically abusive both to his wife and his newborn son.
That's not surprising, but that's also really upsetting to hear.
Yeah. Alberto and Carmen got in trouble for writing bad checks in New Jersey. And then in 1965, they fled to Texas to get away from all their bad check problems. Sadly, their infant son, Juan, died in El Paso, Texas in July of 1965. This is when Alberto supposedly was on the cusp of the big blow up at the ecumenical conference in Guatemala, or like this was the year that it happened. He was not in Guatemala. He was in Texas. Being an abusive dad and husband. Cornerstone magazine did not publish proof of this, but I do trust them more than I trust Alberto.
Well, they did their due diligence on the Mike Warnke.
Yes, and on John Todd.
Yes.
And on other things that we've researched. This particular article, I didn't have access to their source list like I would have wanted to, because I had to get this article through the Wayback Machine. So I'm not quite comfortable saying I know for sure, but I can tell you who I believe, and it's Cornerstone. Also, 1965 is when Alberto was still supposedly a celibate priest, so having a child at all is kind of an issue for that.
Yeah, I mean, like, Cornerstone is a Christian publication, but from having read what I have read from them, I trust their willingness to do good investigative journalism when they need to.
So let's get to the big blow up. We're going to go back to Guatemala. This big thing, this big ecumenical conference. David W. Daniels in You Don't Know Jack addresses the missing year between the ecumenical conference in 1965 and the miraculous release from the iron lung and escape from Spain in September of 1967. Daniels tells us Alberto just got the date wrong.
Oh.
It was actually in 1966. And I'm hearing all of this in the voice of the guy from Dumb and Dumber. Our pets' heads are falling off. So Alberto just got the date wrong. Duh. It was actually in 1966. Oopsie daisy. He produces evidence for this. So Alberto gave Daniels a flyer from Guatemala City, which advertised Alberto's appearance at a Christian conference. So this is it, right? Like, this is proof that Alberto spoke to a conference of 50,000 people and told them all about the evils of the Catholic Church. His whole story is true. He just got a date wrong, right?
This sounds right.
No. It's wrong.
Okay, so what was he actually in Guatemala for then?
So this document is reproduced in You Don't Know Jack as incontrovertible proof of Alberto's story. This is a conference from the flyer where he spoke in front of all those people. This flyer was printed extremely small in the book, and it's incredibly hard to read. But I ran it through Google Translate and probably increased my future eyeglass prescription in the process. Ran the entire thing through Google Translate. Manually typed it in. You're welcome. It is a flyer for a Christian conference in Guatemala City in 1966 featuring Alberto as a speaker.
Like an ecumenical type of conference, or was it just like a Methodist thing, or was it like a Catholic thing? What kind of conference is it? What's going on here?
So to match Alberto's claims in the book, it has to be both. It has to be a meeting of Catholics and Protestants specifically. The flyer does not mention anything Catholic or ecumenical at all, so here is what I got from Google Translate. How much we thank you for accepting our invitation to the special services, which during the nights of November 20th to 27th we will perform for the honor and glory of the eternal God, and to enjoy communion with each other and together pay adoration to our Savior. Every night from 6:45 p.m. onwards, you will be our special guest. From 6:45 p.m. to 7:30 p.m., we run evangelical movies, clearly biblical. And from 7:30 p.m. onwards, there will be our special services. The message of the Word of God will be in charge of the international evangelist of Spanish nationality, Reverend Dr. Alberto Rivera.
So the only thing, I mean, I guess it is translated from Spanish. So
yeah, so this is just literally exactly what I got it when I put into Google Translate. I did not edit it at all because my Spanish knowledge does not qualify me to do so.
Some of the words in there don't seem particularly Catholic. The only one in there that if I saw that it would jump out to me as Catholic would be communion. But Catholics aren't the only ones that it said enjoy.
Oh,
communion.
enjoy communion with each other. Mm-mm.
You don't think?
No, if this were Catholics talking about Eucharist, it would say to receive Eucharist with each other. It would not be communion, is not the word.
Okay, so that means, so this is like,
let me find the word. Yeah, the word in Spanish is literally communion, COMMUNION.
So this is very Protestant or possibly like Baptist or evangelical sounding language here, is what jumped out to me.
So that's like the inside page of this flyer. I translated the first page. It is a meeting of the Sociedad Los Pescadores, Iglesia Evangelica Cinco Calles, Guatemala City, November 20th to 27th, 1966. Sociedad Los Pescadores. Pescadores? I'm sorry, my accent is so bad. I apologize for the pain that I'm causing some of you out there. It translates to English as Fisherman's Club, which is an incredibly, incredibly common name for men's evangelical Protestant soul-winning groups. It's a Fisherman's Club meeting. So I looked up the church name. It translates to 5 Streets Evangelical Church.
Not Catholic.
No, it's evangelical.
Yeah.
There is one piece of evidence on this flyer that totally convinces me that Alberto is a liar, though. And it's the address. Remember earlier, I told you if this meeting happened, it would absolutely have to be at Estadio Doroteo Guamach Flores, because that was the only stadium in Guatemala that would seat 50,000 people anywhere near the time frame.
But what was the actual address to?
The actual address is listed as 19 Calle 258, Ciudad de Guatemala, Guatemala. So I looked up the address on Google Maps, and it's about 1 kilometer from the stadium.
So he wasn't talking to I mean, is it like...
It's not in the stadium. It's 1 kilometer away from the stadium. It's in the same city. It's not at the stadium.
Is it the kind of building that you could have like a conference at? Like, so maybe he lied about the 50,000 people, or...
And it was like 1,000?
Yeah, I'm thinking it's like a hotel with like a conference room, or is it just like...
No. It took a little bit of digging because they didn't have street view, but I did eventually find an image of the building. It is currently occupied by Primera Iglesia Centroamericana. The inside of the church looks like it would seat about 150 people. And that's generous.
It's just complete.
There is no way that this flyer could be the flyer for the giant ecumenical conference. There is no way. The existence of this flyer doesn't prove that the giant evangelical conference never happened. It does prove that it didn't happen in 1965 because Alberto was back preaching in Guatemala in 1966. But this flyer, like, this is what Alberto presented as proof. This blows my mind.
And they just didn't research into it at all. They just said that, yep, that looks good.
Nobody translated this.
Nobody.
Yeah.
And Jack Chick was living in Southern California. He's in Rancho Cucamonga, LA area. You could throw a rock, you'll find somebody who speaks Spanish 10 feet in any direction of wherever you are at any time in Southern California. And they didn't think to just ask somebody, hey, does this say what this guy says it says?
Yeah, can you just read this to me in English? I will pay you for your translation services.
Yeah, I mean, just literally go up to almost anybody on the... Okay, so... Also, the other thing I'm thinking about here is that Christian evangelicals have a tendency to recount times that they've seen famous preachers in a similar manner to the way that people like you or I, Sadie, would talk about having seen our favorite bands. Like you're saying, oh, I saw Guns N' Roses on the Not in This Lifetime tour in Vegas. And it was like, we talk about that. And Christian evangelicals talk about, oh, I saw this pastor preach his XYZ sermon in 2004, and it was at this church, and it was there with either a huge audience or it was a small audience, and I was in the front row. Or it's like that.
Yeah.
If he had spoken to 50,000 people in Guatemala, certainly we would be able to dig up like one person who had seen him speak or had been at this conference and seen somebody else speak.
So this flyer, assuming that it's real and there weren't any real big red flags, it does show that he preached in Guatemala, but it is the furthest thing from proof of this supposed 50,000 person mega conference. And the fact that Alberto really gave this flyer to David W. Daniels and said, oh, here, this is proof that it happened. I just got the year wrong. I told the truth about the Catholic Church to 50,000 people in 1966, not 1965. And then I got thrown in Catholic jail and got tortured until Jesus rescued me. The fact that Alberto presented this non-evidence is proof that something shady is going on here.
Also, you know, he said he's very specific about the date that he left Catholicism in 1967.
September 18th, 1967.
Yeah, and so he would remember if he'd spent a year in between getting tortured and leaving Catholicism.
Right. And even in the comic, he says it was like 6 months, I believe.
So, I mean, it would make more sense for him to have said 1966 to begin with. The fact that he said 1965 to begin with, and he looked over the comic and he's just like, yep, this sounds about right timeline wise. Like he didn't even do his own research into constructing a narrative that makes sense. It's like, you know, when you watch TV and it's like, maybe it was a year between what happened last season and this season, or maybe it was like 5 minutes. Who knows? It's kind of that kind of thing, but this is like comic book time. This isn't real life time.
So there's one last piece of evidence from You Don't Know Jack that I think we absolutely have to address. And it is an ID card from Spain in 1967. The ID card shows Alberto's face, his name, and he is in his photo on the card. He is wearing a priest collar. This is also presented as evidence for the veracity of Alberto's story in at least one of the comic books. I think this ID card is reprinted it's on the first page of Double Cross, like before we even get into the story.
I mean, anybody can wear a priest collar and have their picture taken.
Yeah, but how did he get it? His occupation on the card, I think, is listed as bishop. The images in the comic book are not quite clear enough to actually be able to read the whole ID card. I guess scanners were not what they are now in 1980, so maybe we can not, let them think that this is, maybe we can give them a break on this.
Yeah.
So Alberto claims that this ID was from right before he was allowed out of the country when he escaped from the asylum. The address on the card is in Barcelona, and the comic does claim that the asylum that the Jesuits put him in was in Barcelona, so this kind of lines up. The year lines up. It's a ID card from 1967. So Alberto, the funniest thing is that the excuse that he gives for this, he gives us totally unnecessary information. He says, well, the church lied and said that I stole over $1 million and left Spain with a woman and I was never a priest. So I guess he's trying to get out ahead of this. I found it's hard to know exactly what he was doing in 1967. I found one article that claims that he was working as the director of a Protestant school in Barcelona and got fired, and then he went to the Catholics and claimed he was being persecuted by the Protestants, and then he weaseled his way into getting a place to sleep in a monastery, and while he was living at the monastery, he stole the priest outfit and got the ID card made.
That's fantastic. That
completely tracks.
That seems like an extremely plausible story. Man, what a hustler.
It 100% makes sense. I don't have actual proof.
I mean, Bob Larson walks around with a priest collar and he's like, because he thinks it looks cool,
right? But Bob Larson probably bought it online.
Yeah.
There's and this particular claim is from a blog called Bible Based Ministries UK, and it's just like a WordPress blog. It's a well-written article, but it's not proof that Rivera was never actually a priest.
I mean, he could have just gone to Spirit Halloween and gotten a priest costume, gone to a tailor and said, hey, I'm a priest, I need some robes made. And you can
right.
You can get a priest collar, you can get a priest costume if you want, as a disguise.
Yeah.
That's I'm seeing a picture of him dressed as a priest is not the thing that is clearly that man is a priest. He could have been a stripper that's shtick was he's I'm dressed as a priest, but I'm actually a stripper or something. He could have been and cast as an extra in a movie. He could have there are so many reasons why he could have been wearing a priest costume and had his picture. That legit could have been a prop from a movie if he was in a movie or something. This is it's not evidence at all.
So the ID card, especially it's not a digital ID card. It's not a real ID with a driver's license number. It's not what we have now. And that's why I brought up my great-grandmother's ID card earlier. That was, my great-grandmother died in 1968 or 1969, if I'm remembering correctly. That was her legal identification card with no picture, no confirmation of, you go into the office, you tell them what your address is, you write it on a card, that's it. So if he managed to get a priest collar somehow, stealing it from a monastery where he was staying, he could just go have an ID card made, and the people who made the ID cards really have no way of tracking that. So I would say this is okay evidence that he was in Spain. He was in Barcelona at some point in 1967, but that's about it.
I mean, he could have been somewhere else entirely and just had a fake Spanish ID made.
I would think that getting a real one might have been easier than getting a fake one in 1967.
That's true.
You got to think like Alberto was a grifter, but he was a pretty lazy grifter. So you have to think about like what would have been easier, him getting a real one under false pretenses or going to the trouble to have a fake made.
Yeah, but also who knows what a Spanish ID card looks like? If he's trying to pass off a grift on somebody, he could just be like, this is my ID card. It's like if you show me like a driver's license from a different country, I'm going to be like, and say I'm like the bouncer at a bar and it's like a fake driver's license from a different country and you're a guy with an accent from that country. I'm like, sure, this is real. Clearly, I don't know what a Slovenian ID looks like. You sound like you're Slovenian. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's, I don't know.
The ID card, I actually just found while you were talking a clearer image of it. It looks legit.
Okay.
But I would say I would accept this as proof that he was in Spain in 1967. June 19th, 1967 specifically is when this card was created.
And he was wearing a priest collar, but we already know that he had a son by that time. So he clearly wasn't a priest at that time. Like,
actually, he had 2 sons before 1967.
So he wasn't a priest. Like, he was married. This dude was married. He was not a priest. Clearly, he was not a priest.
Well, he wasn't legally married because he said that God, he's like, oh, God blessed our marriage. We don't actually have to get married.
Yeah, but like if you're traveling internationally, you can just be like, well, it's common law marriage or whatever, like Kent Hovind does.
Yeah, and there was another... No, I'm wrong. He had 1 son previous to 1967 who had already died, and then he had a second son in 1968 who mysteriously disappeared.
Oh, it was like David Hiles?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so they were in Texas, and then he had an ID card made in Spain in 1967, and then in 1968 he pops up in Tennessee, swindling another Protestant denomination, and then after that he was in Florida, and he was wanted by the police in Florida for the theft of a credit card and an automobile from church people that he was grifting in Florida. And then he had another son, and then that son just kind of falls off the face of the earth. We don't know what happened to him. And then in Washington State, he preached at revival meetings until the pastors in Washington got word from Florida that, hey, this guy is not for real. He's a grifter. And then people from Florida tried to come to Washington State to arrest him, but he got away. That's all from the Bible-Based Ministries UK article. So I don't know, but that's evidently what happened.
I mean, there's more evidence that we could probably dig up about this guy if we had more time, and we're gonna really...
Yeah, we'll see like what we have time to get into in part 2. We'll come back next week. We're gonna dig into his supposed rescue of his sister from a convent in London. We'll tell you a little bit more about what Alberto was doing, or allegedly doing, between 1968 and 1980 when his story broke through Jack Chick. But we've also done some really interesting work tracking down where these conspiracy theories came from. Like, if Alberto is making this all up, what gave him the idea? And it's fascinating, and I'm extremely excited to tell you about it.
The conspiracy that he claims is going on with the Vatican is like, it's crazy, but I can't wait for that. And I can't wait to talk to you guys again next week. Once again, if you like our show, if you're a fan of our show, make sure you join our Patreon, where we have an extended version of today's episode. You can join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Eden Exodus. You can join our subreddit, reddit.com/r/Eden Exodus. Social media. Oh, you can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram and Threads now, because we're on Threads.
Oh, we have Threads now?
Yeah, I mean, you just like go into your Instagram and say, I want to be on Threads, and it'll automatically move you over to Threads. And like everybody who you're following on Instagram, you'll follow them on Threads as well if they're on Threads. It's like super easy.
Yeah, I don't want to do Threads because I've heard that if you want to delete your Threads account, you also delete your Instagram. And I'm just not jazzed about the idea of downloading a new social media that I can't get rid of without getting rid of a social media that I actually value.
Oh, okay, that's fair. I mean, they'll probably fix that eventually.
I mean, I'll probably end up on Threads because I said the same thing about TikTok, and now I will never leave TikTok until somebody bans it.
Yeah. Well, and Twitter is like on that ocean gate whatever thing. It's I mean, it's going down and it's getting crushed. But anyway, we're on Threads. If you follow us on Instagram, you can follow the link to our Threads, but it's just Leaving Eden Podcast. You can follow us on you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram and Threads, I guess, at GAVRIELHACOHEN. Sadie, your socials?
You can follow me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music, on Twitter at Hell Yeah Sadie, and on TikTok at Sadie Carpenter 1.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You guys have a great day. Bye-bye.
But old rolling river of time healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways. I'm so thankful I decided